She came to clean his penthouse and left owning the one thing no woman had ever touched. Young Min-jae was the most feared man in Seoul. Cold, untouchable, perfectly controlled. Every woman who had tried to reach him walked away with nothing but their pride in pieces. But Mary was different. She wasn't trying to reach him. She wasn't trying to do anything except survive. And on a rain-soaked Tuesday night, when she whispered 3 words through a darkened corridor that changed everything, something ancient and terrifying woke up inside him, something that no amount of power or discipline could put back to sleep. Welcome to Black and Soul TV. Please like, share, and subscribe. The penthouse on the 42nd floor of the Miri Tower was not a home. It was a statement. Floor-to-ceiling windows that looked down on Seoul like a throne room looks down on its subjects. Marble cold enough to draw the heat from bare feet. Furniture chosen by a designer who had never been asked what comfort meant. Young Min-jae lived there alone, and he preferred it that way. He was 34 years old. He had built the Jaesung organization from the ruins of his father's broken empire into the most precisely run criminal network in South Korea. He had survived 3 assassination attempts, 2 government investigations, and 1 war with the Russian syndicate that had left 6 men dead and 0 evidence pointing back to him. He was feared in boardrooms and back alleys equally. Respected the way people respect a loaded gun, from a careful distance. But there was one thing young Min-jae could not do. One thing that had quietly become the source of whispered speculation among his inner circle. No woman moved him, not in the way that mattered. Beautiful women had been placed in his path deliberately, strategically, hopefully, by allies who wanted leverage, by enemies who wanted weakness. None of them had ever found what they were looking for. Min-jae would look at them the way he looked at everything else in his life. With cold assessment. With complete detachment. And they would eventually stop trying. His doctor had tested everything and found nothing wrong. His closest advisor, Park Sung-ho, had quietly suggested therapy. Min-jae had looked at him with such quiet menace that Sung-ho never raised the subject again. Whatever the problem was, it lived somewhere beyond medicine. Somewhere beyond logic. Min-jae had accepted it the way he accepted all inconvenient truths. He locked it away. He moved on. He ran his empire. That was his life. Until the Tuesday that Mary arrived. The housekeeping agency sent a new girl because the previous one had quit without explanation. Nobody explained why. The previous one had made the mistake of trying to linger near Min-jae's study, of smiling too often, of existing in his space with too much intention. He had called the agency and requested a replacement with 2 words. Start over. And so they sent Mary. She arrived at 7 in the morning with a black uniform, a caddy of cleaning supplies, and absolutely 0 interest in impressing anyone. She was curvy and unhurried, with deep brown skin and natural hair pinned under a modest wrap. She moved through the penthouse the way water moves through a landscape. Without apology, without performance. She cleaned because that was the job and she needed the money, and that was the entire equation as far as she was concerned. Min-jae was in a meeting in his home office when she arrived. He did not acknowledge her. She did not expect him to. She started with the kitchen, worked her way through the living space, and had finished the main corridor by the time his meeting ended and he stepped out. He almost walked past her. She was on her knees scrubbing the baseboard near the hallway entrance, earbuds in, lips moving slightly to whatever she was listening to. He stopped. Not because of beauty, though she was beautiful. Not because of intention, because she had none directed at him. He stopped because in 4 years of living in that penthouse, no one had ever cleaned that particular baseboard. He looked at it. Then he looked at her. She did not look up. He walked away, but something followed him into the kitchen that had never followed him before. A feeling he could not immediately name. The next morning she returned. And the morning after that. By the end of the first week, Min-jae had noticed 3 things about Mary that he could not explain noticing. First, she always started with the spaces most people ignored. Corners, baseboards, the undersides of shelves. Second, she never touched anything on his desk, not to move it, not to dust around it, never. Third, she hummed when she thought she was alone. A low, rich, unhurried sound that moved through the penthouse like something warm. He told himself he was merely observant. Observation was survival. It meant nothing. But on Friday morning, he came out of his bedroom earlier than usual and found her standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows, her cleaning cloth forgotten in her hand, looking out at Seoul the way he sometimes looked at it himself, like she was trying to figure out what it owed her, like the answer kept changing. He stood in the doorway and watched her for 11 seconds. He counted. She did not know he was there. Then she exhaled, picked up her cloth, and went back to work. He returned to his room, and sat on the edge of his bed for a long moment doing absolutely nothing, which was something Young Min-jae almost never did. A few days later, his inner circle gathered in the penthouse for a strategy meeting. 6 men around his dining table, suits and silence, and the low hum of encrypted phones. Mary was cleaning the adjacent room. One of the men, Oh Kyung-soo, younger and too comfortable in his own attractiveness, got up to refill his water. He passed through the doorway and found Mary. He stopped. He smiled. He said something low and close that made her shoulders tighten. Min-jae, from across the room, saw her shoulders tighten. He was across the table and in that doorway before he had consciously decided to move. He looked at Oh Kyung-soo with the particular stillness that everyone in the Jaesung organization had learned to fear. Kyung-soo stepped back immediately. Min-jae did not say a single word. He did not need to. Kyung-soo returned to the table. Min-jae looked at Mary. She was looking at him with something cautious and unreadable in her expression. He said simply, "Finish the east corridor first." Then he returned to his seat. Sung-ho caught his eye across the table. Min-jae looked through him. That evening, after everyone had gone, Min-jae sat alone in the darkened living room. He was not thinking about business. He was thinking about the way Mary's shoulders had tightened and the speed at which his own body had responded to it. The proprietary fury that had moved through him like electricity. He had felt things tonight that he had not felt in years. No, that was not accurate. He had felt things tonight that he had never felt before. And all of it was pointed at a woman who did not even particularly seem to notice him. He poured a glass of water and drank it and told himself it was proximity. It meant nothing. Later that night, he called Sung-ho. "I want her background checked. Standard security protocol." Sung-ho was quiet for a moment. "The new housekeeper?" Min-jae said nothing, which meant yes. Sung-ho said, "Of course." He paused again. "Is there something specific I should be looking for?" Min-jae ended the call. Min-jae sets his eyes on his maid in a quest of true love. What did the maid have specially that caught his eyes? Can she finally quench his hunger? Hit that subscribe button. Let's dive in. The report came back 2 days later. Mary Peters, 29, originally from Lagos, resident in Seoul for 3 years on a work visa. No criminal record. No political affiliations. No connections to any of his enemies. She was supporting a younger sibling studying at university back home. She worked 2 jobs. The housekeeping position was the better-paying one. Min-jae read the report twice, folded it, put it in the drawer where he kept things he did not want to examine too closely, and told himself that was the end of it. It was not the end of it. The following week, he began to notice the moments before she arrived. The particular quality of the penthouse silence at 6:45 in the morning that was different from the silence at 7:15 after she had been there for a while. He noticed when she was running slightly late. He did not acknowledge that he had noticed. He simply found reasons to be in the common areas more often. Working from his laptop at the dining table instead of his office. Taking calls near the kitchen window. Existing, quietly and deliberately, in the spaces she moved through. He told himself he was working. On a Thursday morning 3 weeks after she had started, the water pressure in the east bathroom failed while Mary was cleaning it. She came to find him, which required knocking on his office door, which no one on the housekeeping staff had ever done before. He said come in before he had registered that it was her knock and not Sung-ho's. She opened the door just wide enough to speak through the gap. She told him about the water pressure. Her voice was low and direct. She was not performing discomfort or performing comfort. She was simply reporting a situation. He looked at her over the top of his glasses, which he only wore when reading documents, and which he suddenly felt exposed wearing. He said he would have maintenance up within the hour. She nodded and closed the door. He sat very still for a moment. Then he took off the glasses. Then he put them back on because he still had documents to read. But the words kept moving on the page. That evening he told Sung-ho to have the east bathroom upgraded entirely. New fixtures. Better ventilation. Sung-ho made a note and said nothing about the fact that the east bathroom was the one the housekeeping staff used. A few days later the tension in his life reached its usual boiling point in an entirely different direction. A rival faction, remnants of the CO network, had been making quiet moves against 2 of his legitimate business fronts. Nothing provable. Nothing loud. Just the particular kind of pressure that only people who wanted to destroy something applied. Min-jae spent 48 hours in near-continuous meetings, calls, and quiet negotiations that sounded like conversations and functioned like warfare. He did not sleep properly. He ate standing up at his kitchen counter at 2 in the morning when no one was there to see it. Mary arrived on Friday morning and found him still in his clothes from the night before, standing at the window with cold coffee. She did not make a sound of surprise. She did not ask if he was all right, which he would have found patronizing and which would have required him to lie. She simply set down her caddy, went to the kitchen, and 20 minutes later placed a fresh cup of coffee on the table near where he was standing. Then she went back to work. He looked at the coffee. Then he looked at her retreating form. Then he picked up the coffee and drank it and felt something move through his chest that was so unfamiliar it took him several seconds to identify it. Warmth. Genuine, unearned, undemanding warmth. Not from the coffee. He set the cup down. He said, quietly, toward the middle distance, "Thank you." She called back from the corridor, "You're welcome." The same way someone says it when they mean it and don't need anything back. He stood there a moment longer. Then he went to change his clothes because he suddenly cared that he was still wearing yesterday's. The confrontation with the CO faction escalated the following week. One of Min-jae's men was followed. A message was left at one of his restaurant fronts. Not a note. A photograph of the restaurant, taken from close range. The message was clear. "We are watching. We can reach you anywhere." Min-jae handled it with the same glacial precision he handled everything. He identified the photographer within 6 hours. He had the CO network's primary funding source cut off within 24. He made no loud moves and left no fingerprints. But the tension in the penthouse thickened like weather before a storm. More men cycled through. More meetings. More silence of the particular kind that meant violence was being quietly calculated in the next room. Mary came on her scheduled days and cleaned around it all. She had a gift, Min-jae noticed, for being present without being an intrusion. For occupying space without demanding acknowledgement of the space she occupied. He found it remarkable. He found himself watching the door at 6:45 every morning. On a Wednesday afternoon, she was cleaning the hallway near his office when one of his men, Baek-hyun, came through the front door fast and loud, speaking urgently into his phone and not watching where he was going. He walked directly into Mary, who was on a stepladder cleaning the upper shelves. The ladder rocked. She grabbed the shelf. The caddy fell. Bottles and cloths scattered across the marble floor. Min-jae was out of his office before Baek-hyun had finished apologizing. He looked at Mary first, checking, before he looked at anything else. She was down from the ladder and unhurt, crouching to collect her supplies, telling Beck it was fine. "It was an accident. Please stop apologizing." Min-jae looked at Beck with a quality of stillness that made the younger man straighten and go pale. Then he crouched down himself and began collecting the scattered bottles from the floor. Mary looked at him. He did not look up. He collected the bottles and handed them to her with the focused efficiency of a man completing a task. Their hands touched briefly in the exchange. Neither of them spoke. He straightened, looked at Beck one more time, and returned to his office without a word. Baek-hyun spent the next 3 days walking through corridors with excessive caution. That night, Min-jae sat at his piano, which he played only when the penthouse was empty, working through a piece he had loved since university. His hands moved, but his mind was somewhere else. On the brief moment of contact. On the complete absence of calculation in her eyes when she had looked up at him. She had not been impressed. She had not been afraid. She had simply been present. He pressed the wrong key. He stopped. He sat with his hands in his lap for a long time. The following evening, he was reviewing security footage from the building's external cameras, a routine review after the CO situation, when he paused on a timestamp. 6:41 in the morning. Mary arriving. He watched her come through the building entrance, sign in, wait for the elevator. The footage was grainy, but her posture was clear. Straight. Unhurried. A woman who carried her own weight without making it visible. He watched until the elevator doors closed. Then he closed the laptop. He called Sung-ho. He said, "Increase her daily rate by 30%, effective immediately." Sung-ho said, "May I ask why?" Min-jae said, "Because the work justifies it." Sung-ho said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Of course." Min-jae ended the call. He was not doing this because he felt anything. He was doing it because it was fair. The distinction felt important. He held on to it. The night everything changed was a Tuesday. It was raining in a way that made Seoul sound like it was being washed clean of something it had been carrying too long. Min-jae had sent his staff home early after receiving confirmation that the CO situation was resolved. The network had fractured. The pressure had stopped. For the first time in 3 weeks, the penthouse held only him. He did not know Mary had stayed late. She had asked the building supervisor earlier that afternoon if she could finish the storage room reorganization she had started, since she had been interrupted twice during the week. The supervisor had said yes. It was after hours. It was a large penthouse. She had not known Min-jae would send everyone else home. He heard the humming first, coming from the east corridor. low and rich and completely at home in the space. He went still in his kitchen. Then he moved toward it. She was in the corridor outside the secondary study, her back to him, reorganizing the storage shelves, humming something slow and unhurried. She had taken off the formal part of her uniform jacket and was working in her plain undershirt. Her natural hair was out of its wrap, coiling freely around her shoulders. She was herself in a way that people only allow themselves to be when they believe no one is watching. He stood at the end of the corridor and watched her in the way he had watched Soul from the windows, trying to figure out what it owed him. Knowing the answer kept changing. She turned and saw him. She did not startle dramatically. She pulled one earbud out and looked at him with that steady, direct gaze he had come to recognize. She said, "I'm sorry, I didn't realize you were still here. I can finish another time." She began to reach for her jacket. He said, "Don't." She stopped. He was looking at her with something in his face that he did not have the architecture to hide anymore. Something that had been building for weeks in the silences and the coffee and the scattered bottles and the brief contact of hands. He said, quietly, "You don't have to go." She studied him. The way she studied things, without rushing to a conclusion. She said, "Are you all right?" He almost said yes automatically, the way he always did. Instead he said, "I don't know," which was the most honest answer he had given anyone in years. She took a breath. He watched her decide something. She put the earbud in her jacket pocket and turned fully toward him. She said, "You know, everybody in this building walks around you like you're made of something that breaks things." She paused. "Are you?" He said, "Sometimes." Silence stretched between them. The rain pressed against the windows. The corridor was narrow enough that his presence filled one end of it, and hers filled the other, and what lived in the middle was something neither of them had invited and neither of them was leaving to avoid. Then she looked at him. Really looked, the way she had looked at Soul from his window that first week. Like she was reading something that had been written in a language she had not expected to understand. And she said it. Low, certain, not flirtatious, not cruel, simply true. She said, "You know, I can make you hard." Why she insane saying this? The confidence, audacity was out of this word. She knew what he needed, and she wasn't scared to say it to him. Can you guess what happens next? Hit that subscribe button and don't miss a thing. Not the way those words are usually meant. Not as a weapon or a performance. She meant it the way a blacksmith means it when they say it about steel. I can make you hard. I can put enough heat and pressure on the thing inside you that has gone soft from loneliness and cold from control, and I can make it into something that holds. Something that does not bend. Something that does not break. He understood her. He understood her completely and immediately, which was the most terrifying thing that had ever happened to him. He did not move for a long moment. Then he said, "You don't know what you're saying." She said, "I know exactly what I'm saying. The difference between you and every other man in this building is that they're hard on the outside and there's nothing inside." She looked at him steadily. "You're the opposite." His jaw tightened. He said, "You should leave." She said, "You told me not to go 2 minutes ago." He said, "I changed my mind." She said, "No, you didn't." He closed the distance between them in 3 steps. Not touching, just close. Close enough that the warmth of her reached him through the cool, recycled air of the corridor. He looked down at her. She looked up at him. Neither of them moved for what felt like a very long time. He said, "This is not something you want to be involved in." She said, "I didn't ask for your assessment of what I want." He said, "I am dangerous." She said, "I grew up in Chicago. I know what dangerous looks like. It doesn't scare me." Something cracked open in his chest. Very quietly. Like a fault line that has been building for years, finally releasing exactly 1 millimeter of pressure. He stepped back. He said, "Go home, Mary." It was not a dismissal. It was the only protection he knew how to offer someone he did not want to hurt. She held his gaze for one more moment. Then she picked up her jacket and her caddy, and she walked past him down the corridor. She did not look back. She did not need to. They both knew something had shifted that could not be shifted back. He stood in the corridor alone for a long time after she left. The rain continued. Soul continued. Inside Young Min-jae, something continued too. Something new and terrible and entirely his. Moving through him like heat through cold stone. The next morning, she came at 7 as usual. He was at the dining table with his laptop. She came in, signed the timesheet, picked up her caddy. She did not mention the corridor. Neither did he. But the air between them had a different weight now. Not awkward. Dense. The way air feels before rain. He found himself watching her from behind the open laptop. The way she moved. The way she made ordinary things look considered. He caught himself and looked back at his screen. He had been on the same paragraph for 11 minutes. Sung-ho arrived at 9 for their weekly review. He stopped in the doorway of the dining room and looked between Min Jae and the direction Mary had gone and said nothing. He sat. He opened his files. After 20 minutes, he said, carefully, "You seem distracted." Min Jae said, "I'm not." Sung-ho said, "Of course." He made a note of something that had nothing to do with the files. Later that afternoon, one of Min Jae's business rivals, Director Lim from a competing legitimate enterprise they used for laundering, arrived for a scheduled meeting. Lim was polished and calculating and the kind of man who tested every room he walked into for weakness. He arrived early and was shown to the living room while Min Jae finished a call. Mary was cleaning nearby. Min Jae came in 5 minutes later and found Lim standing close to Mary, looking at her with an expression that had too much in it, saying something smooth and low. Mary had her arms crossed in that particular way women cross their arms when they are dealing with something tiresome and choosing patience over confrontation. Min Jae looked at this scene for exactly 2 seconds. Then he said, "Lim." Just the name. Lim turned, read the room, took 2 steps back and found a chair. Min Jae did not look at Mary. He sat across from Lim and began the meeting with the particular focus of a man using work to contain something that would otherwise require an entirely different kind of release. After Lim left, Min Jae went to his office. He stood at the window. His hands, which were always still, were not quite still. He recognized what he was feeling because he had studied human behavior as a survival tool his entire life. He was jealous. Jealous in the way that men who have never had anything to protect become jealous when they finally find it. Entirely and without proportion. He pressed his hand flat against the cold glass. He breathed. He told himself this was manageable. He told himself she was an employee. He told himself the corridor had been a moment and moments passed. He did not believe a single word of it. That evening he called for his car. He drove himself, which he rarely did, through Gangnam's rain-slicked streets for 40 minutes, thinking, not planning, just thinking, which was also something he rarely did without purpose. When he returned to the penthouse, he went directly to the piano and played for an hour. Not the piece from before. Something harder. Something that asked more of his hands. A few days later, the CO situation produced one final complication. A man from the dissolved network, acting alone and desperately, decided that leverage against Min Jae meant finding something Min Jae cared about. He had been watching the penthouse from the building across the street for a week. He had not found much, except a woman in a black uniform who arrived every morning at 7 and left at 4, and who had recently begun staying late on certain evenings. He took photographs. He made inquiries. He made a mistake. Sung-ho came to Min Jae at 7 in the morning with a folder. He set it on the table. He said, "We have a situation." Min Jae opened the folder. Photographs of Mary coming and going. Her address. Her schedule. A note that had been left at the building's supervisor's station the night before. The note said, "The maid is interesting." Min Jae closed the folder. He was very still. Then he said, "Find him." Sung-ho said, "We already have." Min Jae said, "Move her." Sung-ho said, "She hasn't been told yet." Min Jae said, "I'll tell her." When Mary arrived at 7, he was waiting in the living room. She took one look at his face and set down her caddy without being asked. He told her what had happened, plainly, without excessive detail. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "How long has someone been watching me?" He said, "We believe 1 week." She said, "And you found out this morning?" He said, "Yes." She said, "And you're telling me yourself instead of sending someone else?" He said nothing. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "What does move her mean?" He said, "There is a property. Secure. Staffed. You would be comfortable there while this is resolved." She said, "Resolved how?" He said, "The man responsible will not be a concern after today." She looked at him steadily. She said, "I'm not going to pretend I don't understand what that means." He said, "Then don't." She said, "Am I a target because of you?" He said, "Yes." "I'm sorry." She said, "Don't be sorry. Be certain it won't happen again." He said, "It won't." She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved between them in the living room. The same thing that had moved in the corridor, but older now, more certain of itself. She said, "All right, I'll go, but I want to know when it's done." He said, "You'll know within 24 hours. She picked up her caddy. She paused at the door. She said, "Min Jae." It was the first time she had used his name. He felt it in his chest like a key turning. She said, "Be careful." Then she left. He stood in the empty living room. His head of security appeared in the doorway. Min Jae said, quietly and precisely, "Find him now." The man disappeared. Min Jae sat down at the dining table and opened his laptop and stared at it for 20 minutes without reading a single word. The problem was handled by evening. The man was delivered to the appropriate authorities with sufficient evidence to ensure a lengthy stay. Min Jae's preferred method, when possible. Messy alternatives created paperwork and attention he did not want. He sent Mary a message through Sungho. It said simply, "It's done. You can return tomorrow if you choose." Her reply came back in minutes. It said, "I'll be there at 7. She was different in a way that was not dramatic, but was entirely real. She moved through the penthouse that morning with the awareness of a woman who now knew what the space actually was. Not just a penthouse to be cleaned. The home of a man who had made her a target and then moved immediately to protect her. Who had apologized without excuse and kept his word within a day. Who had said her name in a way that meant something he was not yet ready to say out loud. She cleaned the kitchen. She hummed. He sat at the table with coffee and a document he was not reading. It was, all things considered, one of the better mornings he could remember in a very long time. Over the following weeks, the shape of things changed without either of them announcing it. He began taking his morning coffee later, at the dining table. In the hours she moved through the common areas. She began bringing 2 cups without being asked, setting one near him, taking nothing from the interaction except the small nod of acknowledgement he gave. They talked sometimes, briefly, about the city, about a news story on his laptop screen, about nothing that meant anything and everything that meant something. He told her one evening, when she had stayed late again and the penthouse was quiet, that he had studied law before he had taken over the organization. She looked at him from the other end of the couch where she had sat, with her legs tucked under her, reading a book from his shelf after asking permission with a single raised eyebrow and receiving a nod. She said, "So you know all the laws you're breaking?" He said, "Extensively." She said, "Does that make it easier or harder?" He said, "Harder, usually." She nodded. She went back to her book. He went back to his documents. The comfortable silence between them had a name by now, even if neither of them had said it. He was falling. He knew it with the same certainty. He knew everything. He studied carefully. He was falling toward her in the way that a man who has spent his entire adult life constructing walls falls when someone steps up to them and simply declines to be impressed. The crisis came on a Friday. Not from his enemies. From her. She received a call mid-morning that she stepped into the corridor to take, but the penthouse carried sound in particular ways, and he heard the change in her voice from behind the half-open office door. The professional steadiness giving way to something tight. Something frightened. He was in the corridor in under a minute. She had her back to him. Her hand was pressed flat against the wall the way his had been against the cold glass weeks ago. He heard her say into the phone, "How much?" And then, "I don't have that." And then, "Just give me some time." She ended the call. She stood with her forehead against the wall for one breath. Then she straightened and turned and found him there. She did not pretend she hadn't been overheard. She said, "My brother. The university fees. They've restructured the payment schedule. I don't have what they need by end of month." He said, "How much?" She told him. He said, "Done." She said, "Absolutely not." He said, "It's a loan." She said, "I cannot borrow that from you." He said, "Then consider it an advance on wages." She said, "That's not what that means." He said, "I know." She looked at him. He looked at her. The thing between them breathed. She said, "Why are you like this?" He said, "Like what?" She said, "The outside and the inside." Why is the outside so far from the inside? He had no immediate answer for that. He said, finally, "Because the outside keeps the inside alive." She said, "And what keeps the outside alive?" He did not answer, but something in his face did. She took a breath. She said, "I'll pay you back." Stay tuned for part 2. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you are enjoying the story.